It was a hot afternoon when Marissa stepped out of the doctor's office, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant, and the weight of the baby made each step feel a little harder. The sun beat down on the city street, and she was exhausted after a long day of appointments. All she wanted was to catch the bus home, relax, and rest. As she walked down the sidewalk, she noticed the noise of the busy street around her, people hurrying to their destinations, the sound of car horns, and the hum of the city. Marissa had grown used to it all, but something felt different this time. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Before she could turn around, a man's voice called out, "Excuse me, ma'am." Marissa stopped and looked up. A police officer, Officer Daniels, stood behind her. He had a stern look on his face, and his hand rested on his belt as if he was waiting for something. His uniform was crisp, but the way he stood made her feel uneasy. "Yes, officer," Marissa said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I need to see your ID," he said, his tone firm and unwelcoming. Marissa blinked in confusion. "My ID? I'm just on my way home from a doctor's appointment. I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Daniels didn't seem to care. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Just hand it over. You've been walking around here for a while, and I'm not sure what you're up to." Marissa felt her heart begin to race. "I'm pregnant," she said, trying to stay calm. "I'm just trying to get home. I haven't done anything." But Officer Daniels wasn't listening. "I'm not asking you," he snapped. "You're coming with me." Before she could respond, he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward his police car. Marissa felt the cold grip of his hand on her skin, and her mind raced. She knew she had done nothing wrong. Why was he doing this? "Please, let me go. I'm pregnant," Marissa cried, trying to pull her arm free. But Officer Daniels only tightened his grip. "You're not in a position to argue," he said, his voice harsh. "You're under arrest for disturbing the peace." "Disturbing the peace," Marissa repeated, feeling a wave of disbelief wash over her. "How? I'm just walking to the bus stop." The officer didn't respond. He shoved her into the back of the patrol car, slamming the door behind her with a loud bang. Marissa sat in shock, trying to understand what was happening. She was scared now. All she wanted was to go home, but instead, she was being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. Through the car window, she could see the crowd of people staring, some whispering to each other. She wondered if they knew how wrong this was. She felt trapped, helpless, and confused. Marissa tried to calm herself. She took deep breaths, trying to focus on her baby. She would not let this man take away her peace. But as the patrol car started to drive away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary arrest. There was something off about the way Officer Daniels was treating her, and she didn't know yet, but karma was coming for him. Just not yet. The police car sped down the street, its sirens flashing. Marissa sat quietly in the back, her heart pounding. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Why was she being arrested? She hadn't done anything wrong. She tried to focus on her breathing, but the anxiety was growing stronger with each passing moment. As the car drove further away from the busy city streets, Marissa stared out the window. The world outside seemed so far away. The car turned into a quieter area and pulled into the parking lot of a police station. The doors opened, and Marissa was led out by Officer Daniels, still gripping her arm tightly. "Please," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I'm pregnant. Can you please let me go?" But the officer didn't seem to care. "You'll get your chance to explain yourself soon enough," he said, without even looking at her. He pushed her through the heavy doors of the station, and Marissa was led down a cold hallway. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the silence. As they walked, she felt like a prisoner. This wasn't the life she had imagined. All she wanted was to go home, but now she was trapped in this dark, unfamiliar place. Marissa was taken to a small holding area, a cold, empty room with a single chair against the wall. The officer motioned for her to sit down, but Marissa stayed standing. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, trying to stay calm. Her voice was steady, though it wavered just slightly from the fear that gripped her. "Why are you treating me like this?" Officer Daniels didn't answer. He turned and walked out, leaving Marissa alone in the small room. She could hear the sound of voices in the hallway, but she was too upset to pay attention to what they were saying. All she could focus on was the growing ache in her stomach. She placed a hand gently on her belly, trying to comfort herself. "It's okay, baby," she whispered under her breath. "We'll get through this. Just stay calm." She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The minutes felt like hours. She couldn't understand why she had been arrested or why Officer Daniels was treating her like a criminal. Nothing made sense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Officer Daniels returned. He stood in the doorway, looking at her without saying a word. Marissa stood up, her hands shaking. "Please, just let me go. I'll go straight home. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You'll get your chance to explain everything. But for now, stay quiet." Marissa clenched her fists, frustration building inside her. She was tired. She wanted to go home. She was scared for her baby, scared for what might happen next. But she refused to let fear take over. She wasn't going to let this man break her. "Please," she said again, her voice more forceful this time. "I don't deserve this. I'm just trying to get home." But the officer didn't seem to care. He just turned and walked away, leaving her alone once again. Marissa's mind raced. She knew she had to stay strong. Something wasn't right here. She didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it deep inside. She had to hold on, for herself and for her baby. As the minutes passed, she kept her mind focused on one thing. She wasn't going to let this situation break her. She would stand up for herself. And deep down, she knew one thing for sure. Karma would soon be on its way, and Officer Daniels wouldn't escape the consequences of his actions for long. Marissa sat quietly in the small holding room, her hands resting on her lap. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Her stomach ached, but it wasn't just from the pregnancy. It was the anxiety, the fear of the unknown. She was still struggling to understand why this was happening. Why had she been arrested? The officer, Daniels, hadn't returned yet. She was left alone with only her thoughts, and the silence was almost unbearable. The walls felt like they were closing in, and she had to fight the urge to panic. She glanced down at her phone, which was in her pocket. She hadn't been able to reach anyone, and that made her feel even more isolated. Her heart ached for her family, for her sister, Tasha, who must have been worried sick. Marissa wished she could just call her and tell her everything, but she knew it wouldn't help right now. There was nothing she could do. Not yet. Finally, the door creaked open, and Officer Daniels stepped inside. He looked at her for a long moment before sitting down across from her. There was no kindness in his eyes, only coldness. "So," he began, his voice sharp, "let's get this straight. You were walking down the street, and I stopped you for what?" "Nothing. Just because I felt like it." "What exactly were you doing there?" Marissa's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe he was treating her like this. She wasn't the one who was in the wrong, but it felt like he was trying to make her feel guilty. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was on my way home from a doctor's appointment. You stopped me for no reason." Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You've got some attitude for someone who's in trouble," he said with a smirk. Marissa felt her frustration building, but she kept it inside. She had to stay calm. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Daniels ignored her words. He started flipping through a notebook, pretending to take notes, but Marissa could see the smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. It was like he was enjoying this moment, like he was in control, and she was nothing more than a target for his power. Minutes passed, and the tension in the room grew thicker. Marissa couldn't take it anymore. She had to speak up. "Please," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm pregnant. I just want to go home. I don't deserve to be treated like this." But Daniels didn't seem moved. He barely looked at her as he continued to flip through his notes. "You're going to sit here and wait until I decide what happens next," he said dismissively. Marissa's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't stay here like this. She had to do something. But what? Just as the fear began to rise again, she reminded herself to breathe. She wasn't alone. Her family would fight for her. She wouldn't let this officer break her. And then a thought hit her. What if this was a sign? What if this moment was part of something bigger? She wasn't sure how or when, but she had a feeling that karma was on the way. Officer Daniels would not get away with this. As the officer continued to ignore her, she closed her eyes for a moment, focused on her breathing. She would stay strong. No matter how hard this was, no matter how long it took, she wasn't going to let this situation defeat her. In the silence that followed, Marissa began to feel a strange sense of peace. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew deep down that justice would come. And Officer Daniels would soon understand that no one, not even him, could get away with cruelty for long. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second dragging as Marissa sat in the holding room. She felt as though time had frozen, and her mind raced with questions. Why had she been arrested? Why was Officer Daniels treating her like this? It felt so unfair, so wrong. Marissa's thoughts kept returning to her baby. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, trying to stay calm. Her baby was the one thing that gave her strength right now. She couldn't let herself break, not now. She had to stay strong for her child. Outside the room, she could hear the low murmur of voices in the hallway. She strained to catch a word or two, but it was hard to make anything out. Just when she thought she might lose her patience completely, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Officer Daniels. A different officer entered the room. He was taller, with short cropped hair and a more serious expression. His uniform was neat, and he carried himself with authority. "Ms. Marissa," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Sergeant Carter. I need to speak with you." Marissa blinked in surprise. "Sergeant, what's going on? Why am I here?" Sergeant Carter motioned for her to sit. "We've reviewed the situation, and there's something you need to know. Officer Daniels has made some questionable choices today. We're investigating him right now." Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what that meant, but it sounded like things were starting to change. She hadn't expected this turn of events. "What do you mean?" she asked, still trying to make sense of it all. Sergeant Carter leaned forward. "We've received complaints about Officer Daniels' conduct, and we've been monitoring the situation. There are other officers here who've seen what happened, and we're looking into it." Marissa felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time since the arrest, she felt like someone was finally listening to her. But she didn't want to get her hopes up too quickly. She needed to hear more. "So, what does that mean for me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You'll be released soon," Sergeant Carter said. "We're making sure everything is sorted out. You haven't done anything wrong. Officer Daniels is being taken off duty for now, and we'll make sure you're not charged with anything." Marissa couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything she'd been through, after all the fear and confusion, it was finally starting to look like justice was on her side. "I'm not being charged?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sergeant Carter shook his head. "No, there's no reason to hold you. You'll be free to go once the paperwork is done." Tears filled Marissa's eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. It was hard to believe this was happening, but she was so grateful. "Thank you," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you for listening." Sergeant Carter nodded. "It's the right thing to do. We'll make sure this is handled properly." Just as Sergeant Carter was about to leave, another officer entered the room. Marissa could see the officer had something important to say, but she couldn't make out the words. It wasn't until the officer stepped closer that she understood. "We've just received some new information," the officer said to Sergeant Carter, his voice urgent. "There's been a situation outside the station. Officer Daniels, he's involved." Marissa's curiosity piqued. Was Officer Daniels about to face the consequences of his actions? She didn't know what was happening, but something told her it wouldn't be long before karma caught up with him. Marissa sat in the cold room, trying to take in everything that Sergeant Carter had said. Her mind was still spinning. She had expected the worst, but now it seemed like things were finally starting to turn around. The officer who had arrested her, Officer Daniels, was being investigated. She was going to be released soon. Relief washed over her in waves, but the fear and uncertainty of the past few hours still lingered in the back of her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She looked up to see Sergeant Carter re-enter the room, holding a phone in his hand. "Ms. Marissa, there's someone on the phone for you," he said, his voice softer now, almost kind. "It's your sister. She's been worried." Marissa's heart skipped a beat. Tasha, her sister, the one person she could always count on. She quickly took the phone, her hand shaking as she brought it to her ear. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Marissa," Tasha's voice came through, full of worry and concern. "Where are you? I've been calling for hours. What's going on? Are you okay?" Marissa could feel the weight of her sister's worry, and her own emotions began to spill over. "Tasha, I'm okay. I'm in the police station. I don't know what happened. They arrested me for no reason. But I'm fine. I'm going to be okay." Tasha was silent for a moment, likely processing the shock of hearing what had happened. "What do you mean, arrested? This is crazy. I'm on my way, don't worry. We'll get you out of there." Marissa shook her head, even though her sister couldn't see her. "No, Tasha. It's okay. They're releasing me. Officer Daniels is being investigated. They said it was a mistake." Tasha's voice softened. "That's good, but I'll still be there soon. I want to make sure you're okay." Marissa smiled, feeling the comfort of her sister's words. "I know. I just can't believe this is happening. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know you didn't," Tasha replied quickly. "You just stay calm, okay? We'll get to the bottom of this." The line went quiet for a moment, and Marissa felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Her sister's support made everything feel a little bit more bearable. As the phone call continued, Sergeant Carter stood quietly nearby, waiting for Marissa to finish. When she finally ended the call, he looked at her, his expression serious but respectful. "Ms. Marissa, I'm glad you're able to talk with your sister," he said. "I just wanted to let you know that we've looked into Officer Daniels more closely. His actions today were inappropriate, and he's been removed from duty." Marissa nodded, still processing everything. "What happens to him now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing curiosity. Sergeant Carter hesitated for a moment before answering. "There will be an internal investigation. We can't disclose all the details right now, but I can assure you that this isn't going unnoticed." Marissa took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation finally start to lift. Officer Daniels was being held accountable. She hadn't been imagining it. This wasn't just a mistake. It was an injustice, and it was being addressed. "I'm just glad it's over," she said quietly, almost to herself. Sergeant Carter gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not over yet. You'll be free to go soon. I'm sure your sister is anxious to see you." Marissa nodded. She couldn't wait to leave this place and get back to her family. But a part of her also knew that this story wasn't finished. She wasn't going to forget what happened today. Officer Daniels would have to face the consequences of his actions, and in a way, she couldn't help but feel like karma had already begun to do its work. Just then, another officer entered the room, holding a folder. He handed it to Sergeant Carter, who nodded and began reviewing the papers inside. Marissa couldn't help but wonder what else was happening behind the scenes. Whatever it was, It felt like everything was starting to align in her favor. Marissa sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. The air in the small room felt cooler now, and she could hear the soft sound of voices in the hallway. Sergeant Carter was still reviewing the papers the other officer had handed him, and Marissa couldn't help but wonder what was going on. It seemed like things were moving quickly now, and she was starting to feel a glimmer of hope. After what felt like a long moment, Sergeant Carter looked up from the papers. His expression was more serious than before. "Ms. Marissa, I need you to come with me," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Marissa stood up quickly, her heart racing. "What's going on? Am I free to go?" Sergeant Carter nodded, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like there was more to the story. "Yes, you're being released. But there's something important you need to know. Please come with me." Marissa followed him through the narrow hallways of the police station. They passed a few officers who seemed busy with paperwork or talking quietly among themselves, but nobody paid her much attention. It was clear that something big was happening behind the scenes, and Marissa couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They finally reached a small office at the end of the hall. The door was open, and inside, Officer Daniels was sitting at a desk, his head in his hands. The sight of him made Marissa's stomach turn. After everything he had put her through, it was hard to see him like this. Sergeant Carter stepped inside the office first, and Marissa followed. Daniels looked up at them, his face pale and tired. "Ms. Marissa, please have a seat," Sergeant Carter said, motioning to a chair near the door. Marissa hesitated for a moment, but then she sat down. She wanted to know what was happening, but she also wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Daniels looked at her for a long moment, his eyes avoiding hers. He seemed ashamed, and for a second, Marissa almost felt sorry for him. But then she remembered how he had treated her, how he had arrested her for no reason, and the anger started to build inside her again. "I'm sorry," Daniels said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I made a mistake. I shouldn't have arrested you. I don't know what I was thinking." Marissa raised an eyebrow. She hadn't expected an apology, but she wasn't sure if she believed it. "What's going to happen to you?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. Sergeant Carter stepped forward, his tone firm. "Officer Daniels is being placed under investigation for his actions today. He has been suspended from duty while we look into everything that happened. We will be reviewing his conduct, and there will be consequences." Daniels nodded, his face showing a mix of guilt and regret. "I never should have treated you that way. I'm sorry for everything I put you through." Marissa couldn't say anything at first. She was still processing everything. Officer Daniels was being held accountable for his actions, and that was what mattered. But she also knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger issue. His apology, though important, didn't take away the fear he had caused her. "I'm not the only one who's been hurt by your actions," Marissa said quietly, "but I'll let the system handle it." Sergeant Carter nodded. "You're right. Officer Daniels will have to answer for what he did, but we are committed to making sure that nothing like this happens again." Marissa felt a sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but things were finally starting to fall into place. She had stood up for herself, and now justice was starting to work. She wasn't going to let this incident define her, but she knew that what had happened today would make a difference for the future. As she stood up to leave the office, Sergeant Carter gave her a reassuring look. "You're free to go, Ms. Marissa. Your sister is waiting for you." Marissa nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She was finally going to go home. And as she walked out of the station, she couldn't help but feel that karma had worked its way into the situation. Officer Daniels would face the consequences of his actions, and Marissa had found the strength to stand up for herself. This was a victory, even if it wasn't the end of the story. The morning sun was shining brightly as Marissa stepped outside the police station, finally free. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. It felt like a new beginning, though part of her still carried the weight of everything that had happened. She had been through so much over the past few hours: fear, confusion, frustration. But now she was stepping into the light of justice. Her sister, Tasha, was standing near the entrance, pacing back and forth. As soon as she saw Marissa, her face lit up with relief. "Marissa," Tasha exclaimed, rushing over to hug her. "I was so worried. Are you okay? What happened?" "I'm fine," Marissa said, pulling back slightly from the hug, still in awe that it was all over. "I'm going to be okay, Tasha. I'm just glad this is finally behind me." Tasha gave her a concerned look, but didn't push her for more details. "I'm so glad you're all right. Let's go home. We need to talk, but I'm just happy you're safe." As they walked to Tasha's car, Marissa couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she had just had with Sergeant Carter. The apology from Officer Daniels had left her feeling conflicted. On the one hand, she was glad that he acknowledged his mistake. But on the other hand, the damage had already been done. His actions had caused her so much stress and fear, and that wasn't something she could easily forget. Once they were in the car, Tasha started asking more questions. "So, what happens now? Is Officer Daniels going to be punished?" Marissa nodded. "Yes. Sergeant Carter told me that Daniels is under investigation. He's been suspended for now, and there will be a full review of what happened. He's going to have to answer for his actions." Tasha looked relieved but still uneasy. "I'm glad he's being held accountable, but it still feels like it isn't enough. He shouldn't have done what he did to you. No one should be treated like that." "I know," Marissa agreed, staring out the window. "But I'm just glad that something's being done. I know there's a bigger system in place, and I trust it to do the right thing." The conversation turned to other topics as they drove, but in Marissa's mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her. This was part of something bigger. Officer Daniels wasn't the only one who needed to be held accountable for his actions. There was a whole system that needed to be looked at, a system that allowed officers like him to treat people unjustly without consequences. When they arrived at Tasha's apartment, Marissa was still processing everything. She knew she had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for others who might face the same kind of injustice. She couldn't let this moment slip by without making sure that people knew what had happened. Tasha gave her a concerned look as they sat down on the couch. "Marissa, I know you're strong, but I want to make sure you're okay. This has been a lot." "I'm okay," Marissa said, though her voice wasn't as steady as she wanted it to be. "It's just been a lot to handle. I'm trying to make sense of it all." Tasha nodded. "I know, but you don't have to do this alone. We'll figure out the next steps together." Marissa smiled, feeling comforted by her sister's support. She was lucky to have someone like Tasha by her side. The next few days were filled with phone calls and meetings. Tasha's legal expertise was invaluable, and she helped Marissa navigate the steps of filing an official complaint. They knew that this wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done. The investigation into Officer Daniels was just the beginning. As they worked together to make sure Marissa's story was heard, they couldn't help but feel that things were starting to change. Justice was on its way, and although it wasn't always easy, it felt good to be a part of something bigger. Marissa knew that the fight for fairness wasn't over, but she was determined to keep pushing for the right thing. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that karma had worked in her favor. Officer Daniels had started to face the consequences of his actions, and it was just the beginning of a long journey toward real change. Marissa sat in her living room, her mind still processing everything that had happened. The days following her release from the police station had been a whirlwind. Tasha had been a steady source of support, helping her navigate the legal steps and ensuring that everything was being handled properly. Marissa was grateful, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was part of something much bigger than herself. Marissa's phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she picked it up quickly. It was a message from Tasha. "The investigation into Officer Daniels is over. You need to hear this." Marissa's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment. It was time to find out what had happened to the officer who had treated her so unfairly. She quickly dialed Tasha's number. "Hey, Tasha, what's going on?" Marissa asked, her voice a little nervous but hopeful. "Marissa," Tasha said, her voice steady, but with a hint of excitement. The investigation is complete. Officer Daniels has been officially fired. They found enough evidence to prove that his actions were completely unjustified. And now he's facing charges for misconduct. Marissa felt a rush of emotions flood through her. She had hoped for this outcome, but hearing it made it feel real. Daniels was no longer a police officer, and he was going to face the consequences for what he had done to her. "I can't believe it," Marissa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's gone." Tasha's voice softened. "Yes, Marissa. They've taken his badge away, and now he has to answer for what he did. It's a big step, but this is what justice looks like, and I think this will help make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Marissa leaned back on the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. It felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Officer Daniels had caused her so much stress, fear, and confusion. But now he was being held accountable. And while that didn't erase the pain, it gave her a sense of peace. She hadn't done anything wrong, and now the truth was out there. As the days passed, the news about Officer Daniels spread quickly. The story was picked up by local news stations, and soon the community was talking about the unjust arrest. Marissa's experience had sparked a conversation about police accountability and the need for change within the system. Marissa was humbled by the support she received from others. People who had heard about her story reached out, offering kind words and encouraging her to keep fighting for justice. It was overwhelming at times, but it also reminded her of the power of standing up for what was right. She wasn't alone in this fight, and her voice was making a difference. The police department took steps to address the issues surrounding Officer Daniels' actions. They began training officers more carefully on how to interact with the public, and there were discussions about reform to ensure better accountability in the future. Marissa knew that real change would take time, but she felt like this was an important step forward. One afternoon, as Marissa sat with Tasha, reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized how much she had grown. The experience had changed her, made her stronger. She had faced something incredibly difficult and come out on the other side with courage and resilience. "I feel like I've learned so much from this," Marissa said, looking at her sister. "It's been hard, but I'm proud of myself. I stood up for what's right, and now things are changing." Tasha smiled warmly. "You did more than just stand up for yourself. You helped bring about change, and that's something to be proud of." Marissa smiled back, feeling a sense of fulfillment. She knew that this wasn't the end. There was still work to be done, but for now, she could breathe easy. Officer Daniels had faced the consequences of his actions, and justice had been served. As Marissa looked out the window, she felt a deep sense of peace. Karma had come full circle, and now it was time to move forward, knowing that the truth had won. It had been a few weeks since Officer Daniels had been fired, and the investigation into his actions had concluded. Marissa had spent that time focusing on her life, her family, and preparing for the birth of her baby. Things had started to return to normal, but there was a part of her that still reflected on everything that had happened. She had learned so much through this experience, not just about the system, but about herself. The fear she had felt during her arrest had been overwhelming, but she had refused to let it control her. Instead, she had chosen to fight back in the only way she knew how, by staying calm, standing up for herself, and trusting that justice would prevail. One afternoon, Marissa sat down with Tasha at their favorite cafe. It had become a sort of tradition for them to meet here, catch up, and talk about everything in their lives. Today, however, was different. Marissa had something important on her mind. "Tasha," Marissa began, looking out the window at the busy street, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything that I went through." Tasha looked up from her coffee, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know you've been processing it all. It was a lot, Marissa. I've learned that justice isn't always easy," Marissa continued, her voice thoughtful. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for. I'm glad Officer Daniels is facing the consequences for what he did. but there's still so much work to do, so much change needed. It's not just about one officer. It's about the system. About making sure people are treated fairly, no matter who they are. Tasha nodded. You're right. This is bigger than just your situation. What you went through can help others too, by showing that when people stand up for what's right, change is possible. Marissa smiled, feeling a sense of pride in her sister's words. I've realized that the most important thing is to speak up when something isn't right, even when it's hard, even when it feels like the world is against you. I never thought I'd be in this position, but now that I've been through it, I feel like I have to use my voice to help make things better. Tasha reached across the table and squeezed Marissa's hand. You've always had that strength in you, Marissa. You've just proven it to yourself. As they sat there, sipping their coffee and chatting about the future, Marissa felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had faced an injustice and come out stronger for it. She had fought not just for herself, but for a better future, for herself and for her baby. Marissa looked down at her growing belly, a smile crossing her face. She was excited for the next chapter of her life. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged. She was a woman who had stood up for herself and had made a difference. Later that week, Marissa received a letter in the mail. It was from the police department, and inside was an official apology for the way she had been treated. It was a small thing, but it felt like another step toward healing. The department acknowledged their mistake and assured her that changes were being made to prevent future incidents like hers. Marissa held the letter in her hands, knowing that this was a sign that things were moving in the right direction. As she looked out the window of her apartment, Marissa thought about how far she had come. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and an unfair situation. But through it all, she had stayed strong. And in the end, she had proven that justice was worth fighting for. She smiled softly, feeling a quiet satisfaction deep in her heart. She had learned that standing up for what was right, even in the hardest of times, was always the right choice. And that was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life.